Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined once again by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, we're live again on the YouTubes and out into the Twitterverse. We're heading into week 11 now. We've only got a few weeks left of the fantasy regular season, which means, there's a lot of the maybe non-contending teams likely to drop off here. So the list of waiver wire targets a little tighter this week as there's fewer teams aggressively pursuing these free agents of ours. So how you doing as we gear up for this home stretch before the fantasy playoffs?
Doing well. I think like 4 weeks left in most regular seasons, and bigger leagues like the Scott Fish Bowl, even less than that. And we actually have a more interesting list of waiver wire targets this week. It seemed like the last 2 weeks it was the same guys that you expected heading into the week, no one really earning their way onto the waiver wire list. This week we have a couple new names.
Yeah, it's gonna be exciting. A few new names here, and yeah, there's one right at the top we'll get into. But for anybody that wants to check out the article as well, Nate wrote up this the entire article of waiver wire targets on PFF.com. You can get access to that along with the many other valuable tools and resources with a PFF Plus subscription. So you can get in there, check that out, and then we're live, like I said before. So feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as we kind of go through our names here and as they make sense. But Nate, let's talk about one of those new names here right at the top. An exciting rookie to start here, rostered in just 1% of ESPN leagues and maybe new lead back for the Denver Broncos. We've been hearing rumblings about more work for Audric Estime, and we got it this week.
Yeah, had been a couple weeks now where there were reports on Sunday morning of he would get more work, and then it just never materialized. He kept on playing like late in the fourth quarter of games, so it was hard to get too excited about him prior to this week. But this week we saw him take the clear majority of carries for the team. He reached double-digit carries where Javonte Williams only ran the ball once in this game. Estime was the clear early down back. It was a bit of a rotation of guys outside of that, so he only played just over 50% of the early downs. Williams largely restricted to a third down roll, a 2-minute drill roll, so Williams definitely not as involved. My only concern is it didn't seem like this was necessarily the plan for him to completely take over the backfield heading into the game. Over the first 3 drives, he was not on the field. We still saw Williams starting the game. We still saw McLaughlin get involved early in the game. And then Estime broke off 2 nice runs early on, so they kept on giving him the ball after that. There have been reports since then that they are going to continue to get him involved. I'm just concerned that it could still be a little bit more of a 3-man rotation than we would like to see. But still, he is someone who got double-digit carries regardless of the game script, and we have not seen that on the waiver wire in a while. Any other running back who's gotten a lot of carries, it was fourth quarter blowout game. They gave the backup a lot of carries late in the game. So he is the top running back option on the waiver wire over these past couple weeks.
Yeah, it makes sense. And like you said, maybe more of a hot hand situation, but either way, like this is an exciting young player here. There were a lot of encouraging metrics to his game coming out of college as well. Like he scored well in a lot of like career metrics for running backs. He was like 84th percentile in explosive run rate since 2018. He had the highest rushing grade versus stacked boxes in that cohort as well, with like a 92.1 career rushing grade of 95.3 coming out of college. So there's a lot to like. And I know there was a lot to like about Javonte Williams. He had elite metrics coming out as well, but since his injury, he hasn't been quite the same either. So there's opportunity here. If Estime can seize this opportunity, there's upside. But like you said, there's a chance that all of these guys kind of get work, and maybe it's more of a frustrating hot hand type situation. But definitely a name that, I'm excited to see here on the waiver targets this week. All right, let's get with our next name on the list. Gus Edwards of the Los Angeles Chargers was activated off injured reserve just in time to play in this Week 10 game. Nate, we haven't seen Edwards since Week 4. So what's got him number 2 on the waiver wire priority list this week?
So the Chargers basically went right back to the rotation that they had around week 4 with Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins had earned the starting role early on in the season, with Edwards still playing a significant number of snaps on early downs. And then when he was on the field, consistently running with the ball, Kamani Vidal went back to being a healthy inactive. So I would not be surprised if Vidal remains inactive throughout the rest of the season. The big difference this week is Edwards looked a lot better as a runner. Over the first 4 weeks, he was consistently averaging 3.3 yards per carry or worse. So Edwards really was not looking good in this Chargers offense. This week, 10 carries, 55 yards. Dobbins struggled a little bit more in this game. So it's entirely possible that Edwards sees even more playing time going forward if he's going to keep playing well. There is a little bit of a concern in that the Chargers' next couple of opponents, a lot of teams where they're going to be passing the ball a bit more, not as much running the ball. So Edwards is probably not someone you can put in your fantasy starting lineup right now. But one of the big things that has me excited is they play the Patriots in the fantasy championship weekend. If Edwards can earn a bigger role by that week, that could be a game where the Chargers are running the ball a lot, and we could see Edwards with 15 or so carries in that game.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. Like you said, I kind of highlighted the same thing here as far as, they over the last few games, or 4 of their last 5, they've actually won all of their games, 4 of the last 5 by a touchdown or more. But like you said, the schedule gets a little bit tougher now. They're playing the Bengals, then the Ravens, then the Falcons, then the Chiefs, then the Bucks. So we could see a little bit more of those pass-heavy game scripts, like you said. And it seemed like Dobbins got more of the passing work this week, so that could help him. But like you said, there's room for Gus Edwards to emerge here, and then a nice matchup in the fantasy playoffs there. So let's move on to the next running back on the list, heading to Minnesota now, where we got an injury scare from Aaron Jones. He was carted to the locker room with at one point with a ribs injury, I guess it was, but luckily he was able to return to the game. But in the meantime, we got a mix of Ty Chandler and Cam Akers filling in while Jones was out. So Nate, you've listed Akers as the preference here. What's got him as the favorite to be Jones's backup over Chandler?
So the past 2 weeks, or I guess 3 weeks now, it's been pretty noteworthy that Akers has been playing more than Chandler. Last week, Chandler did not play at all, and this week, Chandler was not playing at all until the Jones injury. So it had been a clear Cam Akers as the number 2 running back in Minnesota. Previously, we thought it could be potentially injury related or something like that, but Chandler was not on the injury report. So I believe it's simply Akers has become the number 2 running back for Minnesota. So first off, Akers was someone worth picking up simply because he is the handcuff in Minnesota. But with the Jones injury that kept him out for part of the fourth quarter, it is a little bit concerning. Jones has had multiple injuries recently. He is on the older side for running backs and did get banged up a bit last season as well. So Akers moves to the top of these kind of handcuffs players who won't have any value unless the starter is injured. But because Jones has been dealing with injuries recently, has a history of injuries, and potentially it could be worse than we thought this week. So Akers is at the top of the handcuffs because he has that potential of being a starter in the near future if something were to happen or get worse for Jones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty clearly out-touched Ty Chandler 13-4, 13 carries and a reception in there. We've seen Akers have some fantasy value before, even if it was a small sample. It's been more than what we've seen from Ty Chandler, and like you said, Jones been dealing with injuries recently as well. So let's talk about our breaking news guy from last week's trade deadline show, Khalil Herbert, now of the Cincinnati Bengals. No special graphic this week with alarms and all that stuff, sadly. But Nate, was obviously a short week when the Bengals acquired him as they played on Thursday Night Football. He was active for that game, played just 2 snaps on offense, but that's it. So we're expecting maybe more of a role in future weeks, I'd imagine.
He had only been on the team for less than 3 full days, so it's understandable he didn't have a huge role. And on that first play, not miscommunication, but muffed the hand off. Yeah. So that was probably more on him. So that also potentially contributed to his playing time. But Herbert, we expect him to be more of a passing down back, and then take some snaps on early downs. The reason that I have him higher than some of these other handcuffs is, even though we think he's just going to be the third down back and then take a couple snaps here and there on early downs, we don't necessarily know that for sure. Chase Brown has broken a lot of big plays, which has been good, but Khalil Herbert in his career has been a bit more consistent, consistently getting first downs, consistently getting at least a couple yards. So I think Herbert is someone who, at least by PFF grade, has been pretty comparable to Chase Brown in his career. So there is at least a chance that Herbert ends up seeing a significant role in this offense. So that's the reason we have Herbert ahead of some of these other handcuffs, is even though we think he's going to be a clear backup, we just don't know that for sure. And there is time for Herbert to potentially earn some playing time in Cincinnati.
Yeah. Yeah. And I still feel like, I don't know, relatively encouraged by Chase Brown, even still, like, just his, like, I think there's going to be some value too. Like, we've seen some value out of him in the passing game, that especially this past week, he had like 10 targets, 9 receptions against the Ravens. Like, obviously we're not going to get that every week, but that's something that we haven't really seen be a part of Herbert's game. And I don't think he's ever had more than 5 targets in his entire career. Right. So I'd like to see that from Brown. I think he could still be fantasy relevant down the stretch here, as long as, he can hold off Khalil Herbert completely. But there's still room. I'm a believer in Chase Brown, but all right, let's lock in on our more of our handcuffs here now, Nate. We're down to just a few of them right now, but looking at Braylon Allen of the New York Jets, Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, and Blake Corum of the Los Angeles Rams. We've covered these guys before in the same spot, but anything you want to add to this group, Nate?
Just we have seen a little bit more of Trey Benson recently. The Cardinals had a very good game this past week. A lot of long drives, which allowed Benson to get a little bit more playing time, and then played late in the game. And even it got late enough in the game that they went further down the depth chart than Benson. So that was good to see. All three of them here, not just because they are rookies who have played well given their opportunities, but they are all three guys where their teams have very good schedules for running backs over the rest of the way. So if there was an injury to the starter, then these rookies would have a ton of fantasy value. So if you have a roster spot, especially now that we're roughly halfway through bye weeks, and we'll get much quicker through bye weeks in the next week or two, if you have those roster spots where someone isn't going to start on your roster the rest of the year and there's no reason to expect them to play a lot better than they're currently playing, then it's better to drop them and pick up one of these kind of running backs who only is going to have fantasy value if the starter gets injured. But if the starter does get injured, then they will be potentially a starter on your team and play very well throughout the fantasy playoffs for you.
Yeah, no, it clearly it's just going to take an injury, because even Kyron Williams fumbling last night did not increase Blake Corum's usage at all in that game. So it just handcuffs for injuries at this point. But last name on the list is Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens. We've been talking about him all season, it feels like, but he finally made his season debut on Thursday Night Football in Week 10. Not much playing time, but that's not really a surprise considering the injury and the amount of time off, Nate.
Yeah, each week there's been a little bit more good news for him, and now he's actually playing, which is the bit of good news. It was a highly competitive game on Thursday Night Football. Mitchell is someone that I would definitely expect to see more playing time in the weeks where the Ravens are winning by a bit more, and then Mitchell is able to mix in. So we will hopefully see more than the coach has said that it's going to be a bit of a 3-man rotation, so a chance that he mixes in even in some of these competitive games, which will be good to see. Probably only having fantasy value if something were to happen to Derrick Henry, but he is a very talented player, and there could be a week or two in there where the Ravens have a 2 or 3 score lead and Mitchell is able to get to double-digit carries as well as Derrick Henry, since they do want to keep Henry at least somewhat well rested for the playoffs.
Yeah, I think that's logical for sure. I mean, like you said, we saw Mitchell have a pretty nice like RB2 type stretch in there last year before he got hurt, and that was with Gus Edwards in the mix. But yeah, not expecting him to do exactly the same with Derrick Henry in there, but could be a nice stash that you're happy you made if you have the space, just in case. Okay, we do got a running back question here from JKR. He asks, for a bench spot, would you recommend between Keaton Mitchell, Audric Estime, Trey Benson, or Jalen Wright? Currently has James Conner, Devin Achane, and Javonte Williams, I guess, in a half PPR league. So obviously we put Audric Estime at the top of the list. That would be your pick here, Nate?
I think so, yeah. If you can only start 2 running backs, then you're probably starting Connor and HN each week, even if you have Estime. So I could understand an argument for picking up Trey Benson instead, just because Benson probably has the higher upside if he does become the starter, and then you're also secure if James Conner suffers an injury. But in general, Estime is the guy out of all the running backs that I'd be picking up this week.
There you go. All right, we'll go on to the wide receivers here in a second. But first, I want to shout out our friends at DraftKings Pick 6. The best part of football season, checking out the post-game stats. Which wideout scored more than 2 touchdowns? Which quarterbacks threw for less than 350 yards? Think you could pick who will do what before kickoff? Then play Pick 6 from DraftKings, an official daily fantasy partner of the NFL. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app. Select between 2 and 6 players and choose if they'll have more or less of a stat. It's that simple. And for all first-time Pick 6 players, check this out. New customers play $5 on your first pick set. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5 on your first pick set. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits expire in 6 months. Limited time offer. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos. All right, let's talk some wide receivers now, Nate, and we'll start at the top. As this group is also led by a rookie. This one out of Carolina, it's Xavier Legette. Though I wouldn't hate a shout out to Jalen Coker in here as well. But we've seen Legette kind of operate as the wide receiver 1 for this team, Nate. So what do you like about the 32nd overall pick rest of season?
Yeah, so they traded Jonathan Mingo away, which really helped the wide receiver rotation this week. We saw Legette rarely leave the field on offense, which was very good to see for him. The offense in general has to start playing a little bit better, but the matchups are fairly good for the Carolina wide receivers over the rest of the season. Only reason I don't have Jalen on here is because Adam Thielen will potentially be back. And then once he is back, a lot of his role overlaps with what Coker's been doing. So I don't know how big of a role Coker will have going forward, but I know they really like Xavier Legette, and I think he'll continue to be the clear top outside wide receiver for Carolina. So when you're able to get a top wide receiver on a team mixed with a good schedule the rest of the way, happy to have them on the top of the list, even if they've had some inconsistent performances over the past couple weeks.
Fair. Yeah. I mean, yeah, even with old man Thielen coming back, I still believe in Jalen Coker. Since like week 8, he's led the team in target rate, yards per route run, receiving grade. He's been really good. I don't know. We'll see what happens with Adam Thielen, but I think this is a team that should be looking to the future and not rolling out Adam Thielen out there as a starter, but we'll see. All right. Speaking of other first round wide receivers, Quentin Johnston has strung together back-to-back games with a touchdown, and like we mentioned earlier, this Chargers offense has been clicking, maybe some more pass heavy game scripts going forward that might benefit Quentin Johnston, Nate.
Oh, yeah. And before his injury, he was also scoring touchdowns. So I think he's at 5 touchdowns in his last 5 fully healthy games, which is really good to see. He has a decent target rate, 18.8%, leading the outside receivers with 1.99 yards per route run on the team. I had been concerned a bit with DJ Chark returning to the team. He was finally active this week, only played 1 offensive snap on a 4th down on a run play. So it doesn't seem like DJ Chark is really factoring into their plans too much right now. And if he does, it might not be at the expense of Johnston. So I think the Chargers, we mentioned with Gus Edwards before, Chargers have a lot of upcoming opponents that not just are going to be competitive teams, but also teams that have allowed a lot of receiving yards, a lot of receiving touchdowns to the team. So I think Johnston running more routes against some of these teams will hopefully have a little bit higher target number, a little bit more receiving yards to go along with that touchdown potential. So I think he is someone that has a bright future with Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's looking good for him, and it might be the last time we cover him on this show for a bit too. Rostered in 45% of ESPN leagues right now, so he's getting close to not qualifying. But just want to point out just how much more effective he's been in year 2 here, because it's been quite the glow up for him. He played every game last year. He went from a 58.7 receiving grade and 0.88 yards per route run, both of which ranked outside the top 80 of 96 qualifying wide receivers, to a 72.1 receiving grade and 1.99 yards per route run so far this year. Both Both are inside the top 40 among 108 qualifying wide receivers. Teams trusted him a bit more, like you said, 19% target rate compared to 13% as a rookie. So getting more volume and doing much more with it. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think he maybe still has the stink on him from his rookie season, which, to be fair, he did look like kind of dead on arrival, but he's turned it around here this year and has been great to see. So excited about Quentin Johnston here, potentially continuing his strong second season.
I do want to interrupt you for some breaking news. Shane
Ooh.
Waldron fired from the Chicago Bears. So Waldron is out. Thomas Brown, who has been the passing game coordinator, will take over as the offensive coordinator going forward. Had been the offensive coordinator for the Panthers last year, assistant coach, running back, tight end, and with the Rams for a couple years in there as well. So new offensive coordinator for Chicago going forward. My big thing, a lot of the offseason with the Bears is a lot of what Shane Waldron had done with Seattle. We had been seeing with Chicago. A lot of that kind of stopped happening. We stopped seeing that weird tight end rotation that he's used. Travis Homer stopped being the third down back, which part of that was due to injury, but he has been back from injury, hasn't taken over as the third down back. So at least some of the player usage, rotation stuff, I don't think we'll see going forward. And especially with Brown's history with the Rams and the Rams being a team that doesn't rotate their guys a lot, I think we will just continue to see a lot of DeAndre Swift at running back, the 3 wide receivers playing 11 personnel a lot, Cole Kmet on the field a lot. Hopefully we'll change up some of what they're doing in terms of either play calling or that kind of stuff to get the offense going a little bit more. But at least in terms of how often players are on the field, I don't see this having too big of a change in Chicago.
Nice. Yeah. So, okay. Waldron's out. Eberflus keeps his job for now. I'm sure there will be more changes to that team as we get closer to the offseason and into the offseason as well, because they just haven't been very good. So let's turn our attention to Marquez Valdez-Scantling of the New Orleans Saints, available in 99% of ESPN leagues. Nate had a massive game in Week 10, bringing in 3 catches for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns. With the Saints wide receivers dropping like flies, I guess it was nice to see someone step up here, Nate.
On one hand, he was like the clear best wide receiver that's available on the waiver wires in terms of their last week scoring. But we also have a long history of Valdez-Scantling with the Packers, with the Bills most recently, with the Chiefs in there, where we know he hasn't been a consistent fantasy starter by any means. But considering the injuries the Saints have had at wide receiver, he could also be the top receiving option for the team over the rest of the season. So I think he is a bit of a gamble. I wouldn't spend a ton of money to get him if you have to spend your waiver money on him, but I think he has that potential to make those big plays like we saw. And now that he's been on the team for a couple of weeks, and now that they saw what he can do, they'll probably be at least drawing up a couple more plays to get him involved, or at least giving him some of those plays that Rashid Shaheed was getting with the Saints. So I think he could have some big games and be one of those guys who just maybe has some bad weeks where he's not scoring very much, but also some weeks like this where he has one big catch and then another catch for a touchdown, and that's enough to have him in your fantasy starting lineup those weeks. So a bit of a gamble, but I think one that could pay off more than he has at earlier points in his career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at least helps that, it's Derek Carr at quarterback and not Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler as well. So there's at least some safety there. But actually, we'll talk about our guy Skywalker here, who does have a question related to the Saints wide receivers, because he's got Chris Olave in a 10-team league. He obviously, Olave out 4 weeks, might not even return. Is it okay to drop Olave, and then who should he add? Either Jalen Waddle, Jawan Jennings, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Ricky Pearsall, Keon Coleman, Xavier Legette, or Christian Watson / Romeo Doubs. Any preference for if you would drop Olave there?
Yeah. First off, I would be comfortable dropping him. I don't really see him coming back. Like you said, he'll be out those 4 weeks. By the time he's back, I don't really see the Saints in the playoff picture. So it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for him to return, especially having the 2 concussions over less than a month, and then 3 other previous known concussions, 2 in the NFL, 1 in college. So I think it makes sense for him to sit out the rest of the season. So because of that, I would be fine dropping him. In terms of who to pick up, I haven't given up on Jalen Waddle. He had that very good first drive for the Dolphins and then didn't do much over the rest of the game. So Waddle would probably be my top preference. I think Juwan Jennings is also an interesting one, had a very big game. Only concern is the 49ers schedule for wide receivers isn't the greatest. Romeo Doubs is also one that I like on that list. I think he can have a good rest of season for the Packers.
Nice. So there you go. So one of those players that was actually on that list there for Skywalker is Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. First round rookie wide receiver. He brought in a long touchdown to go along with 73. Oh, sorry. No, we got Darius Slade. Okay, we'll come back to Darius Slade. To go along with 73 receiving yards in week 10. It was the second most receiving yards on the team, even with Juwan Jennings back, along with Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, and George Kittle. You think there's still be some value there with Ricky Pearsall, Nate?
Oh, yeah, it was very good to see. This was the first week of the season where both Juwan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall were active and healthy for the team. I had been concerned that they would have that same role in the slot, and if Brandon Ayuk was healthy, then they probably would be in a rotation for snaps, making neither of them fantasy relevant. But because Brandon Ayuk's out, Juwan Jennings basically played the Brandon Ayuk role, at least in terms of where he was lining up. Still a bit more fluid in where guys were lining up, but at least Jennings was playing in 2 wide receiver sets, Pearsall joining them for 3 wide receiver sets. Both of them have the good weeks. Deebo Samuel has been dealing with injuries. He's been playing through them, but that's likely impacted Samuel's production, which has helped these other wide receivers. But he is a rookie wide receiver who has only played 3 games and has gotten at least 13 PPR points in 2 of those 3 games. So regardless of those circumstances of potentially Deebo Samuel playing better and Pearsall only playing in a part-time role, he has played well enough in very limited games that I'd want him on my roster just in case he continues to play well and he's forced to see more opportunities because he's playing so well, or Deebo Samuel could miss time at some point, which could lead to a larger role. Only big concern is Chris Conley was inactive for this game. Conley had been playing Brandon Ayuk's role the past couple weeks, so there's at least a chance once he's healthy, Conley goes back to seeing some time at X, which would mean Jennings would go back to seeing more time in the slot. So might not be a perfect situation, but we could also just see Conley come back and barely see any playing time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they get a lot of options there. They spread the ball around pretty good last game, but we'll see if they can keep doing that each week here. So let's go back to Darius Slayton, who I skipped over, of the New York Giants. Nate's he rostered in 11% of ESPN leagues. He's been productive this season. He didn't play in the Germany game in week 10, and now they're coming back and we'll get a bye in week 11. So should be healed up by then at the very least. So what do you like about Darius Slayton?
He has scored the 18th most fantasy points for wide receivers between weeks 4 and week 9. Was very productive. A few of those weeks, Malik Neighbors was out, which contributed to things, but Slayton has continued to see a decent number of targets, even with Neighbors back. And the Giants have one of the best schedules for wide receivers the rest of the way from weeks 12 to 16. Every team they face is one of the top 9 teams at allowing fantasy points to wide receivers. So a lot of very favorable matchups for the Giants offense in general. So I think Slayton can have some big weeks there. Could be inconsistent. Some weeks it could be Neighbors having the big week and not Slayton, but I think Slayton is still worth picking up because he is capable of having those big games, and the Giants' schedule will lead to some big games by players going forward.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll be talking about him for a few more weeks here. He'll have a chance to kind of highlight his value here for a bit, because rostered in just 11% of leagues right now. And like we said, going on the bye week this week, but there's some opportunity there in New York as well. Nate, you've highlighted 2 Colts wide receivers bunched together here, Alec Pierce and the rookie A.D. Mitchell. The Joe Flacco, magic, if you could call it that, may have worn off a little bit here, but these 2 guys are pretty involved in the offense, especially with Michael Pittman out.
Oh, yeah. The big thing here is Pittman missed this week, and I wouldn't be all that surprised if Pittman misses more time. Pittman's been on the injury report with a back injury for basically since September, has consistently been missing a lot of the practices. There was talk of him potentially going on IR at some point to give him some time to heal. They hadn't put him on IR, at least to this point, but he did miss a game, so that wasn't great to see. And then the Colts wide receivers did very well with Pittman out. Alec Pierce, rather than playing his typical role, it was Pierce who moved into Michael Pittman's role as a Z receiver, and then Mitchell took over as the X receiver, which is usually Pierce's role. Both wide receivers had over 70 receiving yards. Josh Downs also had more than 70 receiving yards. So this was probably the best the Colts offense has looked for their wide receivers all season long. Pittman, I think his injury has affected him in a major way. Hasn't had that strong of a season. I think only 2 games with over 40 yards. So I think it would make a lot of sense for the Colts to just give Pittman some time off, give him some time to recover from the back injury, because the wide receivers are being productive without him, and they need Pittman at 100% in order for him to be more effective than their current wide receivers. So I could see the Colts continuing to do this wide receiver, not rotation, but have these wide receivers play these roles. So Mitchell being on the field a ton, Pierce being on the field a ton, and then a role where he sees more targets. The only concern is they don't have the best schedule for wide receivers going forward. The Colts, one of the worst schedules, really, multiple matchups against top 5 defenses, and they also have their bye week, but they do face the Lions and the Patriots in weeks 12 and 13, which should be fairly good matchups if Pittman remains out for those games.
Okay. All right. Juju Smith-Schuster's rostership heading in the wrong direction. He's been on the list for a while, but he hasn't been on the field, which is what is hurting his stock, right? He hasn't played since week 5, but maybe he gets back out there soon, Nate.
Yeah, we talked about him. He had that 130-yard game over a month ago, and then he's just remained out ever since then. So it was kept on falling further down this wide receiver waiver list, but I haven't given up on him entirely. This past week, we saw Justin Watson really take that slot role. Previous weeks, we had seen all 3 of their wide receivers kind of rotating in and out in the slot, all playing roughly 1/3 of their snaps there, 2/3 of their snaps on the outside, where this week it was really Watson taking a lot of those slot snaps. So I think once Smith-Schuster is back, he can just take over for Watson, continue playing in the slot. Probably fewer targets for him in general, because DeAndre Hopkins is that outside wide receiver and can take some of those targets. Also, probably fewer snaps for him because he might not be on the field as consistently in 2 wide receiver sets as he was in week 5. But I still think he can play in the slot, and Kansas City wide receivers have a large history of having targets there. So I still think there is some potential for Smith-Schuster this season.
Yeah, that's fair. And we do have a Juju question. We'll get to it at the end here, because a couple of the other names that are in that question are included here. So next up is Mike Williams, another one of the trade deadline names from last week. One we didn't get to discuss during the show because the trade happened after we finished recording. But I know Nick and I talked about him on the Start Sit show. And Williams got out there for his new team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and brought in his 1 target for a 32-yard game-winning touchdown. Nate, how you feeling about Mike Williams in Pittsburgh?
I think he's a nice speculative ad. I think it's hard to really judge any of these guys who a team traded for 1 or even 2 weeks after the trade. Like we saw Jonathan Mingo get traded. He wasn't even active for the team. So Mike Williams, a bit more active than a lot of these other guys who have been traded for a week. Only took a couple of snaps over the course of the game, both in 11 and 12 personnel, consistently going in for Van Jefferson, which is kind of what we expect. If Williams is going to see more playing time, it will very likely be at the expense of Jefferson. And then we saw Williams score that touchdown at the end of the game, which was good to see for him in general after the season he's had and season he had last season, missing most of the year with the injury. So hopefully Williams is able to win some more playing time and win the trust of Russell Wilson, since that'll be a huge part of this as well, is just getting on the same page as Wilson. But the Steelers have the 4th best schedule for wide receivers over the rest of the season. 2 matchups against the Ravens, 2 against the Browns, both among the teams that are allowing the most fantasy points to wide receivers this year. So if Williams is able to win that starting job and be consistently on the field and earn targets from Wilson, he could have a huge rest of the season. Also a chance that he's just a rotational guy the rest of the year. Arthur Smith likes Van Jefferson. He was good enough to be the starter for the season to this point. So, and he was a consistent rotational guy last year for the Falcons. So at least possible that Williams just is a rotational guy. So Williams, someone to pick up, a chance to hit gold with him, but also a chance that he just stays on your bench for as long as he's on your roster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of the concern with him, right? Is just how consistent he'll be, like in that offense specifically, especially playing a similar role to George Pickens. I don't know if we'll be able to trust him every week, but like you said, there's at least potential there if Russell Wilson starts to build a connection with him. But yeah, there's always a chance that he could just be kind of very boom bust as he's kind of been recently. So. Last wide receiver on the list is Noah Brown of the Washington Commanders. Nate, Brown has effectively been operating as like the team's wide receiver too here, so fair amount to like about him kind of going forward as well.
Yeah, has 27 targets over the past 5 weeks, 23rd most for wide receivers. A high target rate, which is also 24th most of the wide receivers with at least 100 routes. So he's just seeing a lot of targets, making some big plays here and there. Washington does rotate their wide receivers a little bit more than you would like to see for fantasy managers. It's fine for them from a strategic standpoint, but Brown as at least the clear number 2 wide receiver on the team. Unlikely to see a larger role for the Commanders going forward, but I think Brown is kind of the perfect guy of if you have bye weeks going forward and you're in one of these deeper leagues where a lot of the guys we talked about are not available. I think Brown is someone that you can kind of safely put in your fantasy lineup, get at least a couple catches out of him. Hopefully one of those is a big catch or potentially maybe even a touchdown. But I think there's a lot riskier players that you can pick up. So I think Brown is that perfect 1 week need him for my starting lineup because multiple of my players are on a bye week or injured or whatever happened. And then you can probably drop him the week after that.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, so we did have actually a question about kind of actually these last few names here, as well as an additional name in the mix. JKR asks if you could rank these wide receivers: Jalen McMillan, Noah Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, and Mike Williams, or any others on waivers. Well, we've got the guys that we talked about earlier. They're all above these guys that are listed here, but wants to know, I guess, who has the highest ceiling and floor of this group.
Yeah. So in order, it's Smith-Schuster, Williams, Brown, McMillan for me. McMillan, the guy that we haven't talked about, concerned because he has been injured. He was active this week, but did not see a snap on offense. They have their bye week, and once they're back, Mike Evans should also hopefully be back. So McMillan, at the very best, would be the number 2 wide receiver for the team. But they've been rotating guys a little bit. They have other guys that they like. I'm not sure McMillan will go completely back to being that clear number 2 wide receiver for the team. I think Sterling Shepard's in the mix. They've been using a lot of different guys, so not as excited about McMillan as I was before. Plus, Cade Otton has played so well at tight end that I don't see Otton's targets going away. So that puts McMillan at best as the 3rd player in targets, maybe even 4th with Rachaad White. So McMillan, the clear 4th on the list for me. Brown, I think, is the one with the safest floor because he's consistently seeing the targets, but he doesn't have the upside because he's rotating out so much. It's either Smith-Schuster or Williams who has the highest ceiling. Smith-Schuster because he's in the Kansas City offense, but Williams, he ends up being the number 2 receiver with some of those matchups against Cleveland and in Baltimore. Those could be some pretty big games. So I think Smith-Schuster has the highest ceiling over the course of the rest of the season, but Williams probably has the highest ceiling for a couple weeks in specific.
Nice. All right, so let's go on here. And I just want to give a shout out to our friends at Fabric by Gerber Life. There are some things school doesn't really teach you, like how to handle the financial world, or that you have to plan now for a successful future later. And that includes for your kids. Fabric makes it easy for you to set up an investment account for your child now that grows with them and helps prepare for their financial future. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. While your kids can't invest while they're minors, a UGMA kids investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now and give their investments more time to grow. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and books to summer camps and after-school activities. And when they're adults, they can use the funds for their first home, new car, or even to start a business. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you 5 minutes. Get started investing with as little as $1 a day, then manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. There are no contribution limits, multiple tax advantages, and their SIPC insured up to $500,000. Plus, no commission fees and just a low, flat monthly maintenance fee. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, MEET fabric.com/fantasy. This is a paid promotion for the Fabric UGMA product and not the investment advisory services. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Custodial services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Terms apply. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Okay, the tight ends are up next. And what is this? Taysom Hill is not the first name on the list. What is happening? Something big must be going on for Will Dissly to top the list this week, Nate. Please share.
Yeah, so we have had 2 weeks now where Hayden Hurst has been back and healthy, and Will Dissly has remained the clear receiving tight end for the Los Angeles Chargers. He has 27 targets over the past 4 weeks, which is the fourth most per tight end, so has very consistently been seeing targets. And even earlier in the season, when he was just a rotational tight end, more of a blocking tight end, he was consistently seeing targets when he was on the field. His 27% targets per route run is the second best for tight ends this season, just behind Evan Ingram. And then when you look at receptions per route run, he is the top tight end this season. And so a big thing is just how many routes is he going to run going forward, because the more routes he runs, the more receptions he's going to have. And he should be running a lot. We've talked about the Chargers at running back, wide receiver, now talking about them at tight end. Over these next 5 weeks, they play the Bengals, Ravens, Falcons, Chiefs, and Buccaneers. All 5 teams among the top 11 at allowing fantasy points to tight ends this season. So a lot of teams where they're going to be passing the ball a lot of those targets are going to be going to Dissly. 2 teams that have allowed a lot to tight ends. So I think he can be a fantasy starter every week for these next couple of weeks. Maybe not going to be able to start him in the fantasy championship weekend because schedule doesn't look quite as good after those 5 games. But at least for these next few weeks, I think he can be in fantasy starting lineups.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I really like this Chargers passing offense right now. They're really kind of turning things around here and providing a little bit more upside there. And Dissly specifically, like, he's led the team in total targets in 3 of the past 4 games. You got a couple teams or 4 teams on a bye, but a couple top tight ends in Trey McBride and Cade Otton on a bye week this week. So Will Dissly, rostered in just 2% of ESPN leagues, could be a really interesting option for this week going up against the Cincinnati Bengals as well. So, let's go to the next name on the list. And then there's Taysom Hill, second on the list this week. But hey, that rostership is heading up at least a full 10% up from last week. And the jack of all trades continues to get some touches and showcase his fantasy potential, which we saw obviously come through in week 9. Not as much this week, but the upside remains, Nate.
Yeah, I believe could have had a touchdown had it not been for, I think it was offensive holding. So Hill could have had a much bigger game. It's been really weird this season in that they try to get him the ball a lot in the first quarter of games, and then he's been disappearing over the rest of the game. So I'm not sure exactly why that's happening, why they don't try to get him the ball more often, and especially with the injuries they've had at running back. Kendre Miller back on injured reserve. Jamal Williams has missed the last 2 weeks. I'm surprised Hill hasn't been getting more carries. They're just giving the ball to Alvin Kamara over and over and over, and I'm not sure why they don't want to give Kamara at least a little bit of a break here and there and let Hill run the ball a little bit more. But Hill at least is seeing a lot more targets than we're used to him seeing at earlier points in his career. Obviously, all the injuries to wide receivers. If you looked at like the 5 wide receivers they started the season with, 3 of them on injured reserve, another one out with injuries. So it's understandable that they are throwing to the tight ends a lot and throwing to Hill more. But hopefully he starts to be a little more consistent. But it's the same thing that it's been all season. Even though he might not be the most consistent tight end, his upside is higher than a lot of other tight ends because he's going to be scoring a lot more touchdowns. They use him a bit more at the goal line than a typical player would see. So Hill, with that higher touchdown upside, makes him a lot more attractive than most tight ends that are usually available off the waiver wire.
Yeah, we saw one of those carries for him. I think it was like a 4th and 2 or something like that from the Falcons 6-yard line. He didn't get it, but there's those packages for him in those key situations where he could take advantage of and potentially even score touchdowns in short yardage situations. So we did get a Taysom Hill question. I think you covered a lot of it here, Nate, as far as what his value is going forward. But do you have a chance, or do you have I guess the thought that he could potentially finish as a top 6 tight end rest of season here?
I think it's certainly possible if he gets enough of those touchdowns and there's some of that touchdown luck we saw basically over the first half of the season. Cole Kmet was a top 6 fantasy tight end due to just 2 good weeks where he scored some touchdowns and had yards in those games. And then he basically hasn't done anything in the other 7 games this season. But the state of tight ends is if you have a couple good weeks, that's good enough to be one of the elite tight ends on the year. So I think it's certainly possible that if Hill scores a touchdown per game or so over the rest of the year, that's good enough to be in the top 6.
Yep, makes sense. All right, let's turn our attention to a new name on the list, and unfortunately on the list because Dalton Kincaid got banked up. So, Nate, tell us about the potential of Dawson Knox as a waiver wire target for the Buffalo Bills.
Yeah, the Bills have a couple of injuries at wide receiver. Keon Coleman, who has missed the last 2 weeks now, already ruled out for next week. Amari Cooper missed the past 2 weeks as well. Hopefully or at least 1 week as well. He could be back this week, but we saw Dalton Kincaid see a very high target share in his limited time this past week before suffering his knee injury. Was not able to return to the game, so Dawson Knox was back to the starting lineup, still rotating in and out a little bit more than you would like to see with Quentin Morris. But the Bills, big thing with him is he plays the Kansas City Chiefs this week. Kansas City has allowed the most fantasy points to tight ends this season, and Knox, before Kincaid was on the team, was someone who did score a lot of touchdowns, was among the leaders in touchdowns per reception or touchdowns per target among tight ends earlier in his career. So I think Knox could have the potential to have a big game specifically this week. F. Kincaid has to miss this game, and like you said, McBride and Naughton both on bye week, so should be a decent number of fantasy managers looking for a tight end specifically for this week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and KJ Frederick in the chat has that exact kind of scenario for him. Like he's got Taysom Hill right now, but do you think he could add Dawson Knox for Taysom Hill? It looks like just for this week specifically because he has K. Dotton on a bye. I know the Bills have a slightly more favorable schedule for tight ends this week than the Saints, but any preference there for just this week?
Oh, yeah, I would be fine with that because you have Kate Otten's going to be the guy in your starting lineup every week for the rest of the season. So since Taysom Hill isn't going to be in your starting lineup outside of potentially this week, I am fine with you picking up the tight end that just gives you the most value this week. So maybe I would wait to see if we see a little bit more information on Kincaid's injury. That's probably the biggest thing because if Kincaid is able to play this week, then you definitely want Hill over Knox. So maybe wait and see, and if Knox is still available on the waiver wire once we get more clarity on Kincaid's injury, then I would be more okay dropping Hill for Knox.
Nice. Okay, let's talk about some rookie tight ends. Starting with Theo Johnson of the New York Giants, been a pretty consistent part of the passing offense recently, Nate.
Yeah, has been catching more passes recently. Still not quite enough to what you want for a fantasy starter, but he has at least been heading in the right direction. His playing time has been consistently high and even higher these past 3 weeks or so than it was earlier in the season. So rarely leaving the field, which is great to see for a rookie tight end. Only saw like 3 receptions over the first 4 weeks, so was almost comically low in terms of how little he was getting targeted compared to how often he was on the field, but has been fairly consistently seeing at least 3 catches a game in recent weeks. And the Giants, as we've said before, have a very good schedule for their passing offense the rest of the year. Have their bye week in week 11, but the best schedule for tight ends. And in the fantasy playoffs, play the Ravens and Colts, 2 teams where they've allowed a ton to tight ends this season, and the Giants will need to be throwing the ball a lot.
Makes sense. Yeah, back-to-back games with 6 targets now for Theo Johnson. Obviously had the touchdown in week 9. Just need the quarterback to get him the ball there. And like you said, there's at least favorable matchups here coming up. The last name on the tight end list is another rookie tight end. We touched on him briefly last week, but officially on the list this week, Jatavian Sanders of the Carolina Panthers found the end zone this week, Nate.
Yeah, Sanders has been playing better recently of the two tight ends, so might have the most upside of the two. The Panthers also have a very good schedule for tight ends. The only concern is if he's going to be part of a rotation, what's the health like of the other tight ends? Tommy Trumbull has consistently been the Panthers starter when he's been healthy, so that's been concerning, but Trumbull has also missed most of the games over the past 6 weeks, and the couple games that he has played, he's either been limited or left early with injury. So hopefully Sanders has played well enough to this point that even once Trumbull's back, Sanders remains a clear starter. But even this past week in their game in Germany, it was him and Ian Thomas who were in a pretty clear rotation over the first 3 drives. They both had 13 of 20 snaps. So Sanders at that time only playing 65% of snaps. Then Ian Thomas went down with an injury, so that Sanders was able to have a very high snap rate over the rest of the game. So it'll be interesting to see the health of Thomas as well. So there's a chance Sanders might only be fantasy relevant if the other two tight ends are injured, but there's also a chance the other two tight ends remain injured as well. So Panthers, very good, I think top 3 or 4 scheduled for tight ends the rest of the way, but they do have their bye week in week 11, so there could be some time for some of these other tight ends to get healthy during the bye week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like Sanders. At the very least for Dynasty too, like there was definitely an argument for him as kind of like the tight end too in this year's rookie class, is more of that kind of receiving weapon out of Texas there, and looks like he's potentially earning that. It's very early in his NFL career, so I don't want to get too excited just yet, but there's definitely some potential there. Let's finish up with some quarterbacks, and we have to start with Russell Wilson, who is now 3-0 as a starter for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and doing so with a couple strong fantasy performances as well, which includes this past week, Nate.
Oh, yeah. First off, I will mention there are a couple of guys that are right around like 48, 49% rostership that I did not include this week just because they are right at that borderline. So first off, just see who's available on your waiver wire. There might be a guy that makes more sense than all of the guys we're talking about, just depending on your league. But Russell Wilson has looked very good recently. He scored 3 touchdowns the past week, is averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game. So that is definitely good enough to be a fantasy starter most weeks. There's always been the concern that Justin Fields is still sitting there on the bench, and Fields is the only other quarterback available on the waiver wire that has scored that many scored a high amount of fantasy points per game. I think out of the top 16 quarterbacks, 14 are taken in almost all leagues, and then it's the 2 Steelers quarterbacks. So even if you ignore the schedule, Wilson is probably the best quarterback to pick up. But then looking at 3 of their next 6 games, they're either playing the Ravens or the Bengals. We saw on Thursday night how much their defenses give up to quarterbacks. So I think Wilson, not an every week starter over the rest of the season, but in the next 6 weeks, he has 3 very good matchups where he can be in fantasy starting lineups those weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, there will be other quarterbacks that are also available on the waiver wire, but Wilson's played really well. But some of the other names here for you on the waiver list this week, one of them is Will Levis making the list for you. Fair to say that, again, after Russell Wilson, there's a pretty significant drop off from the rest of the quarterback options. But hey, desperate times, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you like about Will Levis here?
Yeah, we were talking about him a bit, probably a month or so ago before he was out with an injury, so wasn't including him because we weren't sure when he was going to come back and if he was going to keep the starting job. But it's worth remembering that he has had it very rough so far this year. Started the season with the Bears, the Jets, the Packers, and the Dolphins, 4 of the top 7 teams at preventing fantasy points at quarterback. So even though he did not look good, he did not look good against the best pass defenses that he could be up against. And then started week 6 despite not being 100%. Returned this week against the Chargers, which is his 5th game against a top 7 defense, and he looked pretty decent this time around. Completed 18 of 23 passes for 175 yards and 2 touchdowns. One of those touchdowns did come in garbage time as well as some of those yards, so that is worth noting. But it was again a team going up against a very good defense, and things will get turned around completely over the rest of the year. Second best schedule for quarterbacks, faces the Jaguars twice, the Bengals, the Colts from weeks 14 to week 17. Quarterbacks who face those teams are fairly consistently ranking in the top 12 in fantasy points each week. So I think Levis could turn things around in a fairly significant way over the rest of the season, because we haven't even seen him face an average defense while he's been healthy, let alone some of these best defenses for quarterbacks to face. So I think Levis is someone who can have a much better rest of the season compared to what we've seen so far this season.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. You mentioned the garbage time, like that's going to happen, I think, for this Titans team, and we'll take it. They count, the fantasy points count the same. I think, they're going to be a team that's going to be playing from behind, and they're going to have to pass a lot. And we saw him. He had a top 12 or maybe potentially top 10 fantasy quarterback finish this past week against in a tougher matchup. So there's room for Levis to be a fantasy starter here. Next up on the list is Trey Lance, and we know that the Dallas Cowboys have named Cooper Rush the starter, but let's be honest, another performance like this past week shouldn't last long. So Nate, you like the potential of Trey Lance taking over that role at some point soon?
Yeah, with Lance, it's a lot of the same things that we've liked about him any other time that we thought he was going to be a starter in his NFL career. He runs the ball a lot for a quarterback, and that adds up to a lot of fantasy points. Over the past 4 years, has scrambled on 13% of his dropbacks. Jaden Daniels and Malik Willis are the only ones ahead of him on that list, ahead of guys like Drake May, Justin Fields, Tyler Huntley, Tyrod Taylor, Taysom Hill when he was a full-time quarterback, Lamar Jackson, and Bo Nix. Obviously, some very elite quarterbacks on that list who are great throwers and runners. Lance is not in that category, but compared to some guys like Justin Fields or Taysom Hill when he was at quarterback, those are two guys who were consistent top 12 fantasy quarterbacks when they were on the field. Fields at times a top 6 fantasy quarterback, even though he's not the greatest passer in the world. So Lance, I think, is someone we saw it in his very limited time this past week, ran the ball 3 times for 17 yards, and he ran roughly 1/3 of the time and threw the ball 2/3 of the time. So if you have a quarterback doing that, that's going to lead to a ton of fantasy points. So yeah. Even though Lance isn't the starter, hopefully will be at some point, and the Cowboys do have a pretty elite schedule for quarterbacks. Giants, Bengals, Panthers, and Buccaneers from weeks 13 to 16. So some very good matchups for the Cowboys in there as well.
Yeah, it feels like a matter of time at this point. I mean, it doesn't seem like Dak's going to be coming back here. So Cooper Rush, not going to be the answer. They spent what, a 4th round pick to get Trey Lance in that trade, I think it was, right? So yeah, he'll get his shot. And like you said, there's some fantasy potential there. But speaking of quarterbacks who might get replaced, Daniel Jones is still the quarterback of the New York Giants for now, but we know he's been struggling as well. There are talks of replacing him at some point, but for now, he is the starter, and he has some rushing upside that we can put to use if needed.
Yeah, not the best passing game for him this past week, 22 for 37, 190 yards, 2 interceptions, but his rushing ability yet again saved his fantasy value, ran 7 times for 26 yards and a touchdown. So even though it wasn't great as a passer, his rushing production did put him among some of the better fantasy quarterbacks this past week. And I think that kind of thing can continue, and hopefully he starts putting things together a little bit better in the passing game, because the Giants have their bye week in week 11, but they have the best schedule for quarterbacks the rest of the way. Buccaneers, Cowboys, Saints, Ravens, Falcons, and Colts, all great teams that he should be able to put up some points against, because a lot of other quarterbacks have been able to. So even though it might be scary to put him in your fantasy starting lineup, I think if you become desperate at quarterback, Jones is definitely someone who could finish as a top 12 quarterback in fantasy points over the rest of the season.
All right. And then last quarterback on the list, and don't look now, but Bryce Young has won 2 straight games, leading the Carolina Panthers, looking better than he has since before his benching, but that's also not saying much. But maybe there's some life left in the 2023 first overall pick, Nate.
Yeah, another quarterback where we're concerned if he's going to remain the starter. It sounded like they were a little non-committal on who would be the starting quarterback going forward, which isn't great to see, but he didn't throw the ball too much this past week. They were running the ball so well, so Young did not get the volume needed to be a fantasy starter, but good to see Hubbard playing so well. The Panthers have their bye week in week 11. We did see Young produce a little bit on the ground, 2 carries for 30 yards. So that was pretty nice to see him get some of that rushing production, which always helps your fantasy value. But the Panthers, another team that has a pretty favorable schedule for quarterbacks, particularly in the fantasy playoffs, faces the Cowboys, Cardinals, and Buccaneers, 3 of the top 7 teams at allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks. So if Young starts to play a little bit better, then in the fantasy playoffs, he could be scoring a lot of points.
Nice. All right, that is all of our waiver targets. We do have some questions here. Anything that we should cover? I mean, there's a defense special team question, Nate. Do you want to go on to that one? It's
nah, I've not looked ahead enough to next week to know which defenses to be picking up.
Yeah, it's a little bit.
But I will have my rankings. Yeah, I will have my rankings up later today, and I will have at least some thoughts into defenses at that point. So feel free to check out my rankings. That should be up in plenty of time for you to make your waiver decisions. So just pick whichever defense is ranked highest that you can.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's going to do it for us. Thank you all for tuning in. Get out to those waiver wires, obviously, and stay active. Get those claims in and make that push for the fantasy playoffs. Nate, thank you for putting this list together as always. And before you go, please do remind everybody what you have up on pff.com this week.
Sure. So I have the recaps as usual, all of them up shortly after those games have finished. I have the waiver wire article. If you missed anything today or just want to see it in writing rather than going back and listening to some of this, or if you forget something, it's there. Plus, if there's any news, it'll be updated, but hopefully not a big news day. Luckily, not a lot of injuries this past week. So that was pretty nice to see a lot of guys come back from injuries and not too many guys get hurt. Have the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high. This is the last time I will be writing this article this year because in a lot of leagues, trade deadlines are this week. Definitely check out when the trade deadline is in your league because it can vary from one league to another. But you do want to know that just so you know when the last time you can make trades. Along with that, have the rest of season rankings up today. We'll be having the rankings for next week up within the next couple hours, hopefully. And then, as usual, we'll have start sit on Thursday, the Thursday night football recap. Also want to mention, I've also been posting on more social media sites recently, not just on Twitter, but also on Blue Sky and on Threads, PFF Nate Jahnke on both of those places. So if you are not spending as much time on Twitter recently or want to move on to other sites, there have been a lot of fantasy analysts throughout the industry that have been making Blue Sky accounts in the past week.
I don't even know what Blue Sky is. So that shows you how connected I am in that world. As for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report out later today. That'll have our IDP waiver targets in there. We'll have the wide receiver man zone coverage report out on Thursday morning as well. O-line, D-line matchup article will be out on Friday. And then we'll be doing our week 11 IDP preview episode, as well as the week 11 start sit show with Nick Bodiford later this week as well. So be sure to check those out. Good luck this week. And until next time, peace out.